So just to share with you the agenda for today, we have myself talking now on medical comorbidities in children with neurodevelopmental disorders, particularly more profound autism. And this is part of SENSE3, which is focusing more on older children. The previous two have been focused on preschool and younger children. And then at 3, we have Dr. Thiloka Ratnaike join us. She's an clinical lecturer from Cambridge and Colchester, who's going to talk about the importance of genetic testing and the increasing use of whole genome sequencing for children and their families. And then the last talk will be Kierran Pearce from the Multi Schools Council, who's going to reflect more on mental health and anxiety in school-age children and its impact on school attendance, on physical health, and some of the practical solutions they've been offering in supporting schools from around the area. So it's quite a variety of talks, some of them more clinically oriented, some of them are more related to school and mental health. So there should be something for everyone today. So I will now start mine. I think it's 2 o'clock, so I'm going to start my talk. So you should see my slides. If Steph could just give me an okay, if you can see.
Yeah, all good, yeah.
Great, so I'll start. So this talk is about 45 minutes long. It may well be shorter depending on how fast I go through, but there'll be some time for questions at the end in what is a very important area of medicine. So as a background to myself, I'm a consultant in neurodevelopment at Colchester, and I'm the director for the Synapse Centre, and have set these lecture series up. On a regional level, I work for the ICB to try and better improve commissioning and general awareness, actually, for children who have additional needs in this area. And on a national level, I work with the British Academy of Childhood Disability to better inform and understand research in this area as well. So my talk will concentrate and focus on medical comorbidities in children with autism and learning disability, and the importance of a really good clinical MDT for complex and challenging presentations. So it's coming together as a team to understand really the link between health and behavior and communication, really, because behavior is, by all accounts, communication. So as a background to my talk, the numbers of children with neurodevelopmental disorders is increasing every year, but particularly I would say with autism. This is the current figure from the Lancet Commission, with 1 in 57 individuals within the UK now identifying as being on the autistic spectrum. Some are adult, some are children, but in reality, in both adults and children, that number is going up every year. Really importantly, autism being such a wide umbrella diagnosis, we have to understand that for some children on the spectrum, the health implications of that diagnosis are profound. This figure here is quite a stark one and represents the life expectancy of an individual on the autistic spectrum who also has severe learning impairment. And I would say of the caseload, we have around a fifth of the children we have within ESNEFT have what we would deem profound autism. And this represents a really worrying figure, and also the challenges that medically these children face. This is a recent paper published in Scandinavia, where they're far better at keeping a record longitudinally about health outcomes and reasons for children becoming adults with early mortality. And the 3 biggest reasons for early premature death were respiratory, neurology, so seizures, and gastro problems, so gut failure. which I think is a really up-and-coming area of medicine which we need to better understand, not just within the autism field, but also in other areas such as cerebral palsy. A lot of the children now who are surviving really adverse early life events and ending up profoundly disabled with severe cerebral palsy, they're surviving, but they're increasingly having issues with other comorbidities, and gut dysmotility and gut failure is one of them, and will be a cause for early premature death in the future. The other important figure locally is to know that this population of children with profound autism, so severe autism diagnosed early before the age of 5, this cohort is certainly increasing in number. I've been working in the trust now since 2019, and this number continues to rise year on year. And some people would argue that it's because we're better at diagnosing autism, or we overdiagnose autism. But I guarantee in this age group, you don't need to be an expert to diagnose, because these children are severely impaired and have a number of other health problems alongside the behavioral and learning difficulties, which we need to better understand and manage. And as we know, brain development is increasingly complex speciality, where we're starting to realize that other areas of health have a tremendous importance on how our brains develop, particularly around gut health, early gut health, and immune development, which I think in the next 5 to 10 years will become a whole new area of medicine. And the other focus of the talk is the links between mental and physical health. And this applies not just, I suppose, to children with autism, but to anyone, any adult with anxiety and stress, and the impact this has on our own physical health, particularly regarding cardiovascular health, immune dysregulation, immune problems in progressing to autoimmune disorders, and its impact on our metabolism, our sugar processing, and the general cellular stress that it has. And children with autism, no matter what area they are on the spectrum, anxiety is the big unifier and the common denominator. And most of the children I see with autism have severe anxiety, which has a profound stress on the body, which represents as a communication, at times really challenging behavior, lack of sleep, physical symptoms such as gut issues, tummy pain, migraine, and other physical problems, which, if unmet and not treated, go on to become chronic. And there's definitely a bidirectionality between underlying physical health and mental health, and managing stress and anxiety early can have a tremendous impact on physical health outcomes. The other thing to reflect on with autism, there are many different subtypes of autism. There are some of them are genetic, or I would say syndromic, and linked to disorders such as Fragile X or neurofibromatosis. There are autisms that run in family, so there are underlying genetic causes which aren't syndromic, so they are associated more with long family histories of autism, developmental problems. There are increasingly immune-associated variants of autism, where you'll look back in the family history and not see any history of learning problems or autism, but there's a strong family history of autoimmunity, for example. And then there are environmental causes, which are regarding early birth, infections in utero or postnatally. And they're a mixture of all 3 or 4. So that's the reality. In trying to understand autism and its health issues, we need to try and understand the different subtypes or phenotype autism, look at the genetics, and also understand the underlying health associations. These are really common autism comorbidities: gastrointestinal problems, immune difficulties, seizures, pain, a lot of different sensory processing problems, a lot of issues with metabolism, so sugar control, and disorders of the HPA axis, so thinking more of our endocrine system and the influence on hormones on our system. And there are lots of new areas of research which we can reflect on, particularly around the microbiome, so the bacteria in our gut, the impact on our metabolism, genetics, and the links to other health areas such as cancer biology and autophagy, which is how our body processes and gets rid of cells that we don't need. So let's focus on the first part of the talk on what probably one of the most important and common GI associations with autism, which is gastrointestinal problems. And this can present in a variety of ways. I would say the most common is dysmotility, so problems with constipation, unmet pain needs, which is a really complex area to try and understand because children with additional needs perceive and process pain in very different ways. And what's painful for one child isn't painful for another. And there are many different types of pain which I can go into. Reflux in this area is really underdiagnosed and not managed well, as is underlying inflammation. Nerve supply to the GI tract can differ depending on the child, and there are new areas of research which shows there's actually a type of dystonia which can affect the gut. And anyone who has experienced dystonia or managed children with limb dystonia knows how uncomfortable that can be. Essentially, it's an uncontrolled muscle contraction or cramp, which can cause a severe amount of pain and is triggered normally by underlying events such as anxiety, stress, or some other trauma. And this is the new guideline for GI dystonia through the Association of Gastroenterology, which is showing by nature of the fact they've released this as a definition, an increasing problem in area of complex needs. So moving on first to dysmotility. So this can be esophageal dysmotility, reflux, constipation, or whole gut dysmotility. And if you have a child with dysmotility, it can really impact not only on their gut health, but their general physical health and behavior. It's very common for these children, especially if they're really bunged up, is to start getting gas and trap wind in areas they shouldn't, and bacteria ending up in the small bowel. So common associations are called SIBO, small bowel overgrowth, where bacteria from the colon ends up in the small bowel, where it ferments sugars, causing a lot of wind and pain. So very gassy children who can be very suddenly emotionally labile and get upset very quickly. There's also a concept of visceral hyperalgesia. So many children we see, whilst when they fall over, they don't cry, the pain response to organ stretch, so visceral pain, is profound and very oversensitive. So I typically stretch reception in the bowel. So a normal poo that's passing through the bowel can cause a great deal of up stress and problems, and then exiting the bowel through the rectum. And many children I see have profound issues being relaxed enough state to pass poo will deliberately hold on or withhold because of problems with pain and be really avoidant to having their bottom touched. And I think this is a massive unmet need and one which causes a great deal of pain. And many children with sensory processing issues, in my opinion, are at risk of this. And it's an oversensitivity in the bowel, particularly to stretch. So a normal physical process, which is food going through the stomach and down through the small bowel and colon, causes at times sudden dysregulation and pain in that child in what should be a normal physiological response. So typical GI presentations for children on my caseload: irritability, aggression, anxiety, being hypersensitive. So at the same time as having issues with bowel pain, not wanting to wear clothes, being very upset all of a sudden for no apparent reason, sleep difficulty in particular, frequent early morning waking, typically is a presentation of a child who has unmet constipation needs or dysmotility, because it can cause reflux when the child is lying down, or can have this colic which can manifest and wake children from sleep. Another thing to think about is weight loss in terms of children who are malabsorbing food. And typical pain and medication that can go by some means to help with these kids. If we think it's related to colic, then something like Buscopan, I think as one of the first line medications in a child who we suspect has GI issues would be a medication for reflux, a proton pump inhibitor, because it's easy to trial, relatively easy to trial, and I think it's something which isn't invasive as well. Moving down the line, which is more tertiary level interventions, increasing now neuropathic pain meds are being used, such as gabapentin and clonidine, particularly in severe neurodisability. And the question moving for the future, is there a role for other medications such as cannabinoids, which there are a lot of CB receptors in the gut, and initial certain mouse models have shown can have a really positive impact on behavior and pain. The reality is, within autism, there is an atypical microbiome, and many studies have shown there is a restricted diversity in flora, in bacteria in the stomach, in the gut. And there's many different reasons for that. And one is thought to be inflammation. And the microbiome increasingly is being understood now to have a bidirectional communication between the gut and the brain, and the crosstalk that exists. Which can really potentially impact on developmental programming and how our immune systems develop. And then in quite a busy list here, I think the take home in terms of microbiome pathogenicity, apart from all the issues with steroid hormone synthesis, motility, and gut barrier function, is the training of the immune system. As humans, we learn a lot about our immune systems are trained initially through our gut. A lot of bacteria and viruses come in through it when we're very young and babies. And if that is dysregulated or changed, it could potentially have a tremendous impact, not only on our immune system, but on the whole of the way our brain is architected and sculpted. And I think this area of medicine in particular is misunderstood and has a profound, will have a profound impact on how medicine is managed moving forwards in the next 5 to 10 years. So in terms of, again, a busy slide, but in terms how the immune system can lead to gut permeability, if the gut wall is inflamed and leaky, essentially the gut barrier function that the gut provides is compromised, and a lot of antigenic material, so bacteria, viruses, are let into our systems when they shouldn't be, and our body has to deal and try and clear a lot of extra infection. It leads to a lot of systemic inflammation, and again, systemic inflammation can have a really deleterious effect, not only locally but on other body organs, particularly the brain. And the question is, with this restricted biodiversity in the gut, what are the reasons for it? And theories are early exposure to antibiotics, acute systemic inflammation, and certain types of diet. So there's a lot of work ongoing at the moment in this area. As part of a research, the centre here, the Synapse Centre, we are starting initial trials into this area, and we currently have a trial called Family, where we're recruiting 10 children and an age-matched sibling, so one autistic child and a sibling, and doing stool samples at time point 0, and then again in around 6 weeks' time. And these samples are sent to Quadram, which is a microbiome centre in Norwich, where they will be sequenced and also have some other chemicals analysed to show difference. And the hope that this trial is going to be expanded to an intervention trial, which is looking at how we modify and improve the diversity of the bacteria in the gut of children with autism, and the potential impact this has on behaviour and learning and other aspects to health. So I think this is the first trial of its kind in the UK, and the partnership we have with Quadram will hopefully evolve over the coming years. Quadram also works in other health areas such as Alzheimer's and in chronic fatigue. And in these medical areas, there's a lot of overlap with autism. If you have any further interest in reading further about the gut and barrier function, its relevance to autism and other areas of learning, there's a good article at an Autism Eye, which is quite accessible. It's free online, which I wrote on mucosal IgA and immune surveillance. So I encourage you to read that. Moving on. So another point to think about with these children is immune function. And as I said before, the role of the gut in initial immune surveillance, and how the gut allows in antigenic material, which then has a big impact on our immune system. A lot of our immune cells, both the innate, which is the immune system we're born with, and our adaptive immune system, so our antibody responses, all play a big role in pruning the neurons in our brain, and how that is architected, which obviously affects our learning processes and our development. And increasingly, the role of the immune system in utero and postnatally is being understood, and its importance, as I've said before, with synaptic pruning and brain architecture. And pathogens, including bacteria and viruses, have a capacity to influence developmental trajectory, and the timing of infection and inflammation can have a profound effect on development. This is a really controversial topic, and one that will obviously have an impact on parental behavior, and isn't easy to answer. But the reality is that other viruses and bacteria that aren't COVID still have a similar impact on the systemic inflammatory response, and particularly encephalopathy. So leaving a children with a change in behavior, or a change, I suppose, in learning ability. There are certain children I see on my caseload who regress, for example, who lose language, who lose skills, which we don't fully understand. They don't end up in hospital in an encephalitic state, so with seizures needing intubation and transfer out, but the parents report their behavior changed, and that can be over the space of 1 or 2 weeks. Some children on my caseload I see, one boy in particular, he lost 40 words. He was putting sentences together, and over the course of 2 weeks, he lost all language. He didn't lose any other developmental issues. It was any other regression in motor development, for example, but he lost the ability to talk and the desire to talk. And when a child has such profound decay in one area of development, it's incredibly hard to understand. Sometimes parents aren't believed, for example. That's a classic response, saying, oh, he didn't really have those words, or that it's exaggerated, or there are other things at play, such as trauma, or there's other psychiatric reasons. But for some children, they don't have these reasons. They just lose language. And again, these children don't have access to the testing or the investigations, or an idea really of what testing to do to really understand why this has happened. But I think looking at COVID-19 as a virus, COVID doesn't go into the brain. It just causes this big systemic inflammatory response. And for some children and adults, especially with long COVID, the idea that this chronic systemic inflammation can affect cognitive processing is well known now. And I suppose, what does long COVID look like in a 2-year-old, for example? And I think we just don't know. But no doubt, looking at the incidence of infectious diseases and immune disorders over the last 50 years, the rise of autoimmune disease, which you can see on the right, is growing exponentially. And I would say this rise in autoimmune complications also mirrors this. If you put an autism trend, it maybe would sit to the right of this, but it would still be going up at the same trajectory. And the idea that with our immune system being heightened or oversensitive, this really increases the risk of neurodevelopmental disorders in mothers, and the prevalence of autoimmune disorders in mothers, particularly psoriasis and diabetes, and joint problems such as ankylosing spondylitis, can set an immunological trigger and make the system hyperactive, which the developing fetus is very sensitive to. So it triggers this big stress response in the unborn baby. And in some genetically susceptible children, this sets them on a path to an increased risk of, I would say, autism, but particularly the regressive type. And this is evidenced here in the article below. Having said this, the immune system is also incredibly important for brain development, and increasingly we're realizing that there are many autoantibodies, which are listed below, which are very important for how our brains are sculpted. So I'm not suggesting that all immune activation is bad, but I think we need to understand it better. And again, if you're interested, this is a really good review by Nataf, looking at the evolution of immunity and the emergence of brain autoantigens. So inflammatory insults in pregnancy and the increase in cytokines and inflammatory mediators, no doubt, from a biological perspective, are bad, and they can, in the wrong genetic susceptible children, can these are correlated with a regression and a more severe phenotype of autism. So I'll move back. So typically, I would say I've labeled these as immune presentations in children, is a child who has with a history of regression, with lost language or lost milestones in other areas, or a spiky developmental profile. If a child for 1 month has good gains and then suddenly plateaus, and so never has a consistent trajectory in learning. Typically, these children have issues in other areas of health, particularly abdominal deterioration during periods of ill health. Failure to spike temperature when unwell is another common thing I've found in these kids. They don't seem to be able to spike temperature, and they have a very poor response to antibody response to immunizations. So it's almost like their immune system is so fried from having to being so hyperactive early on that it doesn't work properly to respond as it should. And they're also associated with more food allergies. And again, this is referenced in a paper in 2021, which is below. And potential treatment or support of children at the moment with immune problems are prophylactic antibiotics, which is kind of counterintuitive when you think about it when we talked about the microbiome. Vitamin supplementation, checking immunization responses for things like Hib and tetanus, checking food sensitivities, and adequate management of allergy. So moving on to metabolic. So a lot of children with autism with profound anxiety, their system is completely fried the whole time with stress. So it's almost like, think of the steam engine putting coal onto the engine. And if you're struggling to keep it going, and if you run out of fuel, you run out of fuel, and the system starts to break down. On a cellular level, we obviously rely on sugar as our immediate source of energy, but sugar is stored in other places. One is as glycogen in our liver, but also I would say in terms of batteries in our cells called the mitochondria, and we rely on the mitochondria more efficiently providing us energy through a molecule called ATP. However, if the system is running on full power the whole time with no downtime, this system starts to break down, and the ATP that the mitochondria produce starts to not be produced as much, and the system switches back to direct glucose metabolism. So it's called Warburg effect, whereby the sugar is processed immediately, which is very inefficient, and it burns through sugar very, very quickly. So you end up with a child who is basically very metabolically compromised. And bear in mind, 25% of the brain, sugar ingest goes into the brain. So if this isn't working very well, it can really cause cognitive clouding or issues with learning. And this is only when children are well. So when they are unwell, this stress becomes even worse. So a lot of the children that I see who have profound autism and these issues actually tend to have problems keeping their blood sugar stable during periods of ill health and go into this state that we term ketotic hypoglycemia. So they drop their blood sugar when they're unwell, especially at a younger age. And so supporting the system and supporting this metabolic function is very important, using adequate nutritional support and a better understanding of behavior through our metabolism. For example, when we flick out in and out of ketotic state. So when we run out of sugar and we use all our energy stores and we're not ingesting sugar, we start to use our fat and go into a thing called beta oxidation. And that can make our system acidotic, and it typically can make us feeling groggy, gaggy, and not feel quite nauseous at the start. So this is after a period of fasting. So in the morning, for example, some children who are very anxious or stressed can be in ketosis. So they end up not wanting to eat breakfast. They're not feeling right, and they're very hard to get going in the morning. And to better understand these children metabolically will help their behavior, because rather than encouraging them to eat, hurry up, get ready for school, it's actually better to realize their clinical state has rendered their system vulnerable. So as I said, ketotic hypoglycemia, nausea in the morning, and its associations with things like migraine and cyclical vomiting. And I'm sure you've seen children that maybe you care of who get these episodes of cyclical vomiting at certain times of the month, which can go on for one to 2 days. So management of a child with extreme stress and cellular stress is the idea of someone having regular meals. A lot of these children don't have big meals, but they snack throughout the day. So for schools to enable this, rather than having set times to eat, you allow a child with autism and severe anxiety stress to eat regularly to avoid this. The other thing is supporting the system overnight, so allowing prong release carbohydrate overnight during that period of fasting. So one of the American papers from Kennedy Krieger recommends the use of corn flour, which is a simple intervention which could be mixed in with yogurt prior to bed, which covers that period of metabolic fasting overnight. And when children are really unwell, they do end up dropping their blood sugar. The use of a glucose polymer, which can be a source of energy when that child's unwell. Other things to think about: mitochondrial support or management of cyclical vomiting through other medications. Something in about 10 minutes. The other thing to think about is genetics. And Thiloka is going to talk about genetic testing next. But I think as we move into a new age of medicine and a more idea of personalized care, that we do need to understand our genetics better, and particularly for children who have unexplained autism and learning impairment, because it will really guide and define how these children are treated medically, our expectations of their learning capacity, and to better understand and phenotype different types of autism. The Spectrum 10K was a new trial that was tried to set up 2 years ago through Cambridge, but unfortunately there's been a lot of politics surrounding this trial and getting it underway from different areas of the community, particularly within the autistic community, I think misunderstanding the purpose of it and the engagement processes before starting. And I can't really talk more about this now, but I think hopefully it will start in the future. And the idea that 10,000 autistic individuals have their genome analyzed to look for commonality in genes and understanding the medical reasons why autistic individuals have the challenges they do and why in some people they will be life limited. And that can only be a good thing, right? In America, genetic testing is more widespread in autism, and that's a lot of that is driven through charities and parent groups. On another level, compared to the UK, in many ways, we're many years behind in the UK here. And this is an example of a trial that's just been published looking at how comprehensive now a whole genome testing is in this cohort of children and their parents. A very busy slide, I know, but I would just take these numbers as an idea of how many children they have coming into these genetic testing. So many thousands of individuals now who've had whole genome sequencing done to try and better understand different autisms genetically. And of here, you can see I think there are over 200 genes now associated with autism, thought to be due to, in the main, different areas of synaptic development in the brain, signaling pathways, transcriptional regulation, and other aspects to cellular response. But interestingly, again, none of these are kind of looking at more the immune related genes, which I think would be a really good next step, is to looking at the associations with severe autism and the risk of autoimmune diseases in the family, but also response to viruses such as COVID, which are all pieces of work which are going on at the moment in other areas of health. There's also been the 100,000 Genome Project, but in many ways this has raised more questions than answers. With the 100,000 Genome Project, only certain panels of genes were looked at as well. So, for example, in people recruited into the autism part and learning disability part of this, there were only specific genes that were looked for as part of this project. So many families who I know took part didn't get any significant results from it. The other thing to think about genetics, and maybe Thiloka will touch on this, is just because you have a gene doesn't mean you know if it works. So the next stage of genetics, I suppose, will be more a case of what that gene actually does, how it's functioning, and the role of epigenetics, which is how genes are switched on and off by environmental factors or other genes, which makes the whole process very complex. But no doubt, within genetics, there are emergence of other areas of genes that we know have an impact on brain development in autism, and these are mTOR, RAS, and Wnt. And interestingly, all of these are associated with cancer. And I think piggybacking on the back of cancer research for these children would really help. And the idea of the pruning bush analogy. So a lot of these the Wnt pathway in particular, you get unrestricted, unregulated growth. And if that's in your brain, you get very dense arborization of dendrites. So you get a lot of neurons which are made, but aren't cut or aren't pruned. So you end up with a very dense bush, which doesn't work particularly well, or it's very oversensitive in certain areas. And I think that this area in particular, alongside the immune challenges, would be an area to focus on when it comes to autism. Next one is, I would say, sensory processing, which has a profound impact on how autistic individuals learn and their quality of life. And I'm sure you've all seen this. And we have very many different senses. I don't think we have a grasp on what children with severe autism can actually see. It is very hard to do vision tests on children, but particularly children who have learning impairment and challenging behavior. We can have a rough idea anatomically of the eye. You can have a look at the eye. You can see if there's any strabismus or squint. You can have a look at the back of the eye and look at the fundus to see how the optic disc is. But realistically, you don't get an opportunity in certain children to really understand what they can see. And that's more to do with visual processing and the concept of CVI, which is cerebral visual impairment. There's more awareness of this area in cerebral palsy, to be fair. But I suppose the concept of is, if you can think of children under your care, what they actually can see in terms of color, in terms of depth perception, in terms of speed. So many children, for example, will suddenly get upset with moving animals, almost like they haven't seen the animal until the last minute or have been unable to judge how quick it's been coming. And that's parietal, occipital processing, which can be switched on and off depending on the child's abilities. The other issue, of course, is auditory hypersensitivity, which many children struggle with. And I think many autistic individuals have profound auditory hypersensitivity where we do not really know what they can hear. They seemingly can hear a pin drop a mile away or can hear something which we can't hear. I had one little girl who said she can hear the electricity buzzing in the wall or a fan in a room elsewhere that no one else can hear. And I've no doubt that this is the case. But how we manage this is open to discussion because some people don't think it exists. And when we do, it's managed by, for example, ear defenders or other quite primitive ways of managing. But a lot more research in this area needs to be done because I personally feel this is a tremendous reason why young people don't develop language, because to develop language, you have to acoustic map sounds to be able to understand them. And if they're at such a high level from an early age, you won't be able to understand or make sense of the differences between them. That will just become as a large amount of white noise. Pain, which we've discussed already, what one child processes as pain, another one will not. And the idea of different types of pain, visceral hyperalgesia in particular in the gut, massively misunderstood and again, more research. When the sensory nerves are flaring and really overexposed or overactivated, they start to release chemicals. And one is called CGRP, which we know is associated with migraine. So many of these children have migraines. And again, if you can't tell someone you have a headache, you tend to bang your head, you tend to bury, and you start to have other behaviors you can't struggle to understand. The other aspect to this is when your brain is over challenged and there's too much going on, you are more prone to seizures because it's called excitation inhibition imbalance. So you end up being oversensitive to things, many of these children will go on to develop epilepsy as teenagers. And again, trying to impact on this earlier and understand this EI imbalance is important, because many will have this, it's called subepileptiform discharge. So if you EEG'd 100 children with severe autism, there would be differences which will be difficult to understand, but many of them will have these sudden bursts of activity which are very hard to know what it means. So in certain areas of the brain when this happens, visual auras, feeling very unsafe, depending on where in the brain it is, which can really destabilize and impact on behavior and increase anxiety. So again, this shows how sensory issues, health, bidirectionally can really influence and impact on anxiety. And when anxiety is increased as a natural survival instinct, all of our senses in heighten. So in children in particular going to school refusers, their system is under high levels of stress, which is on another level that we don't really understand. So sensory processing case presentation. So children who have sudden explosions of anger, disinhibition, giggling for no reason, suddenly looking scared, looking to the corner of a room, there's nothing there, seeing things that aren't there. And I genuinely believe this is a phenomenon. Genuinely believe this, and we don't really truly understand the lived experience of these children, how scary life can be. Management of sensory issues is very tough, and this can be anything that improves vagal tone or that vagal negative impact on all this excitation. So things like understanding sensory differences through massage, through diet, and potentially with time through medication. And we were involved with a medication trial a few years ago called bumetanide, who was trying to kind of reset a molecule called GABA, which is our calming de-escalator chemical in the brain. So in summary, I think that's 45 minutes now. Medical comorbidities in autism are really common, but frequently misunderstood. They're very impactful on learning and happiness, and a sensitive understanding and management of these can really have a profound impact on life, learning, and happiness. And working within a big MDT for these children is essential. Expecting a GP working independently to manage this is not fair on them, and it relies a lot more of tertiary, secondary level support. And neurodiversity should be celebrated, and difference should be celebrated, but not at the expense of health and research into treatment. And I think in this area in particular, we have to think differently about how we utilize resources, how we communicate between health and education and social care, and realize that a lot of the behaviors we see are the result of underlying medical issues that aren't being managed. So that is our website, and I'll stop sharing there. So I think we have about 15 minutes, and I'm willing to take questions from anyone if you have any questions for me now. Rebecca.
I know that you've been talking about, in particular, about children with profound severe autism, but a lot of the issues that you have raised are also therefore the more academically able, those who get discharged once they've got their diagnosis. I'm thinking particularly of some of those gut issues that you've been talking about. So where do we go to get support for those young people?
That's a really good question. So I'm not a commissioner, but if I had my way, no, I wouldn't discharge any of the children, and I would make sure they had their health surveyed and managed in an appropriate way. I suppose from a surveillance perspective, we do have our GPs, but one of the first things we would do is try and skill up practitioners and nurse practitioners on the health issues associated with autism, and to have a screening tool to go through the questions to ask and what medications potentially to try to help on GI symptoms or on simple things like reflux, and to escalate treatments accordingly as a first line. But I totally agree with you. Anxiety and stress has a profound impact on the body, no matter what level of learning you have. And a lot of these children have profound medical issues as well, which you've described. Also, the impacts on sleep as well. So did you have any ideas, Rebecca, regarding that?
No, I'm just aware that that what you talked about describes my own children and so many of the children that I work with. And yet, if you go to the GP with those ongoing non-specific GI issues, the support that you get is pretty much useless. And so the improvements that I've been able to make to my own children's gut issues are through my own trial and error, to help them to find have less pain and less discomfort.
And that's a real shame. And I must say, parent advocacy and parents' intervention have a tremendous impact. And what you read and what you do to try and help your own children, certainly in terms of other gut issues, far higher degree of children with celiac disease and food allergy. So dietary interventions can make a big difference alongside other more conventional medication. But I agree. I mean, again, if I had a magic wand, I would have specified clinics to screen and go through all these health issues alongside, because you end up being referred to CAMS, and go down the psychogenic route and somatizing problem. But the children generally have medical issues that aren't being managed, and we need to find a better way of working together between systems to better recognize and manage them. But no doubt dialing down the stress will also have an impact on the gut issues. But it's the chronicity of them, how long they've been going on for. Sometimes they've been on for a long time. It means that you do need medication in other areas, such as the reflux medication or some sort of motility agent or something like that. So I wish I had a question, but it's a really valid point. And I think many children go under the radar, no matter what level of learning you have. And it's a big area of unmet need.
Thank
Claire.
you.
Claire Heath.
Oh, hello. Sorry about that. I was just on mute as I was talking away. So I have a child that's very relevant of all the things that you've been discussing. He sees regression quite often just within his speech. But his diet is so limited. And then so I find that AFID seems to be a thing that just keeps popping up, and for 2 years they've been sending for diagnosis of AFID. But actually, is there any simple testing that they can ask for or even privately get, or is that something that's just not available in the UK right now?
I think with AFID, as you described, which is avoidant restricted food intake, it's a very important area to think of, and very difficult to understand what it means. A lot of people get obsessed with the diagnosis, but it's more a case of meeting the need of that child. Lots of children we see have very, very restricted diets, and they're all interlinked with other areas of sensory difficulty, which are better met if challenged early. So through Synapse Sensor, and I think Andrew is here today, we're looking more at improving sensory differences or managing sensory issues early, to try and have a better impact on appetite and reducing anxiety around food. Because I think from the question you had, Claire, is you don't know where to refer, or
so I just feel like he's being left, basically, not necessarily because the dietitian is trying to help, but it's just not helping. He's got the referral for AFID, he's got all of these things going on, but actually in the middle of this he's just not eating. So actually, what are those reasons for him? Like he's gagging, and that reflex, what you talk about, the anxiety is there, so all of it is there.
So number one would be reflux. And I would definitely trial with a reflux med. It's easy to do before even going down a complex AFID. I mean, do things which we on a waiting list for months, and maybe years. So doing simple things like, as you said, if he's gagging, try him on trial a reflux, making sure that the gut is working. So on a prokinetic or going for a poo regularly. looking for signs of SIBO or gut issues with gas, wind, pain, and just trying to improve how that system works. And if you do that, you're more likely to eat, right?
So I
Because
guess then as a practitioner, sorry, just as a practitioner though,
Yeah.
because as a doctor you can say all these great things, I guess,
Yeah.
and what it could be. But as
Yeah.
a practitioner, I can say go to your paediatrician to
Yeah.
look at these things. But then I guess if they're just not looking at them, is
Yeah.
that where we would make some recommendations, do you think?
We need to have some sort of recommendations based on a guideline understanding the needs of these children, which we don't have. There's no consensus, and I think for simple things done locally would be best. And I think trying to get some sort of guideline together of areas to look for would be a good thing to do. I've given a similar talk to a group of GPs. So the aim is to try and get more information around of simple things to try, but again, really, really hard, because ARFID and what ARFID means needs to be after other interventions have been made. But again, it's the link between psychiatry and other areas of health. There's a big disconnect between the two, and another doctor may have a very different opinion to me on what ARFID is. But no doubt, if you have reflux or you have GI pain, you're not going to want to eat. And it's not related to the food that you either do or do not want to have. You may well have issues with texture and taste and processing of other things. But if you ever struggle with reflux before or bad tummy, you don't want to eat. So surely that should be the first thing to rule out.
And I feel like that's where it's just being left in that instant, is we're just waiting for that diagnosis of AFID to pop out of the air. But actually, he will try things randomly and different things like this, which don't suggest AFID in its own right. So,
and that's the thing, and there are other, for example, children who I'm writing an article at the moment with Andrea on salt-seeking behaviours in children with autism, and children we see with profound salt craving, and what does that mean? And again, if you look at the literature and look at understanding, there are potentially many reasons why, and other blood tests that indicated, for example, sodium levels in the blood, measuring endocrine panels, and thinking of underlying biological reasons why, and not just putting down a salt-seeking craving for autism and saying, "Oh, this is just him." So many kids I see have a salt-seeking behavior, to the point which it stands out as being really abnormal, and we don't investigate or test what that means, because testing is really hard in this group of children, and we don't know really how to interpret the results in some of them.
Okay, thanks.
Any other questions for me? No? Okay. In which case, I will move over to, I think Thiloka is now here. So if I can hand over to you, Thiloka.
Brilliant. Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Let me just see if I can share my slides. First of all, can I just get an idea of the type of audience today? Because I'm not quite sure who might be attending this meeting.
We have a mixture of health visitors, educators, and also health professionals. So a big variety of audience.
Okay. So just while my slides are loading, just to introduce myself, I'm a clinical lecturer for pediatrics, looking at a hybrid job, half research in Manchester. I think my slides are going to take forever to load. And I wanted to just have a sort of an overview talk with you about genomic testing in children. It was really helpful for me just in the chat whether I can have your understanding of genomics, say no understanding at all, some vague understanding, or just fully an expert, just so that I can pitch this talk a little bit.
Your signal isn't great, Thiloka, so we're struggling to hear you.
Comments welcome. Oh no. Let me, if I switch the camera off and see whether
Yeah.
on the NHS internet. So is this any better?
Yeah, that's better now. So if you try sending your slides, if you try showing your slides, and then we can see how.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's just it's half loaded. I don't think it's Oh, so I was just asking earlier, could I get an idea of genomic testing to begin with and your involvement in pediatric research? You can just say none if there's no involvement whatsoever or no understanding, some or lots. Can you see the slides?
Yes, that's great.
And is it in the full presenter mode?
Yes.
Okay, brilliant. Okie dokie. I've had one response, so thank you very much. Oh, great. I'm getting some responses. Thank you. So I thought I'd just do a little whistle stop tour of I don't know why my thing keeps beeping. Just a little whistle stop tour of research in pediatrics. Well, I'm not really going to massively go into that, but go into genomic testing just because that's a massive buzzword at the moment, and talk to you about some of the big databases that are around and what we are doing in Colchester or hoping to do, as that will be relevant to all of us in various sectors of health and social care, I suppose. And I have a feeling Menti is not going to work here, but again, some comments in the chat would be really helpful as to why you think research in pediatrics might be important. And again, you might say it's not important right now, but it would be really helpful to have an idea. Because I think, unfortunately, Menti doesn't work through Teams from my previous experience. The chat might be a bit slow in loading, but I suppose I'll give you a little bit of a flavor as to why research is important. It essentially informs everything that we're doing. The kind of chats you were having just earlier with Dr. Marlow, I just caught the last bit of that conversation about ARFID and what do we do, what do we recommend. That is essentially what we're trying to say from in terms of trying to put guidelines in place. It's usually there's a basis of some type of research, regardless of quality of it. There will be some amount of data collection that has to happen for us to have an idea of what's working, what isn't working, what's good, what's helping, and that for us in pediatrics, because we don't have a very good easy population to access for research purposes in the sense of the children, so consent is a massive issue. It becomes even more important because obviously in pediatric medicine, children aren't little adults, so it's not like you can just extrapolate what adults are doing and just apply it to our pediatric population. We do have to have some studies for our own practice. And lots of good reasons why we should be doing it. And I agree with Andrew who's put there, improve outcomes in children, quality of life and so on. And so coming on to genomics, so it seems that maybe most of the audience might not have too much understanding about genomics. So talk about some of the sort of the basics about it. So there's genetics and there's genomics, and people are getting these days a little bit confused why we use these different terminologies, essentially saying the same things. And listening to a podcast by Genomics England called The G Word, because I'm very cool and I listen to those kind of podcasts. The differentiation, I suppose, genetics essentially is talking about the mapping out of genes, whereas genomics is talking about the mapping out of all of the DNA. And when you think about it, there's over 3 billion letters of your DNA. So the letters are the C, T, A, and G. And that's, you know, if you think about it, these 4 letters are making up everything that, you know, we're able to do and experience in a way from a biological sense. But out of the 3 billion letters, only about 2% of that sequence is genes, as in coding proteins that are doing the things. That's historically the thing that we've been most interested in, because if the genes are affected, proteins are affected, and downstream effects of proteins mean that you will have a disease of some sort. However, now we've started to understand that actually there's a lot more that can go wrong with our whole genome, as in the rest of our sort of the billions of letters, which still have impacts on how our organs and our systems function. So at the moment, we can't just put somebody's blood through a machine and expect in one go all of that DNA to be read out. The machines essentially have to cut up that DNA into short little segments and sequence those segments one at a time, and that's called a read. So when you hear these words in the media, in sort of publications, that's what essentially is happening. And what the clever machines are doing is they're mapping out the segment and then trying to put them all together to then finally get your whole genome read. And then when somebody has a difference to a reference sequence, as in we have a reference set of DNA that we are comparing everyone's DNA to, those differences are called variants. And the variant could be a single letter or it can be a number of letters. And it just depends on how those letters go wrong as to how difficult it becomes to read either that gene or that whole string of genes. And the kind of the very regularly used analogy is as if, you know, you're reading a book and the sentence doesn't make sense because a letter has gone wrong in a couple of words, or the paragraph doesn't make sense because there's big chunks of sentences missing. So there's lots of ways that these variants can occur. And this is just, if you want to know a bit more about kind of some of the fundamentals, genomics education program, which you can just Google and you can get access to, you don't need to be a healthcare professional to do it. Gives you some really nice resources of talking you through with nice videos as well about some of these concepts that I've just been talking about. Does that sort of make sense at the moment? And at the moment, how things are going in terms of what happens practically is we offer, we will see a patient in clinic or in our ward, and we will suggest that this patient might benefit from having their DNA sequenced. So we then offer them a genetic test. It might be the whole genome being sequenced. It might be part of that genome, as in just some of the genes, or it might be a quick overview look of the DNA through something called microarray to look for any big problems with the DNA, for example. And that sample is gathered, it goes off usually to either Cambridge or the other lab. Sometimes we're involved with this in Exeter. They have machines which will essentially sequence the sample and the variants are analyzed through what you call bioinformatics pipelines, which means there's a load of sort of algorithms that are run to see how many variants there are. Are they expected for the patient or not? And then what's fed back to the clinician is a very filtered list of variants, if not, one or a couple, which might be relevant to the patient, depending on what information we have fed in at the start. So if we've said, I suspect this patient might have, X condition, that's usually the condition where the variants are known to be associated that will be then looked at first, and then will be fed back to us whether or not that appears to be true or whether there's a new variant we're not expecting that's been found. And then the clinician, through the help with the geneticist, will then go off and confirm that result with the patient. Let me know if you want me to stop, go back, or whether that kind of sounds fairly straightforward. I'll keep on going. So in terms of genomic testing in pediatrics, the whole basis is that the emphasis is on rare diseases. There are about 1 in 17 people in the UK and who will have a rare disease. If you lump all these rare diseases, by which we mean a disease where the number of people with it at any one time is less than 1 in 2,000. If you lump all those rare conditions together, there will be 1 in 17, roughly, is the estimate at the moment. And we know that a large number of those rare diseases have a genomic component. And half of the new cases of rare diseases or genetic sort of diseases are found in children. So it's massively relevant to pediatrics and has been a big driver for the research projects happening in the genomic medicine world. So if we are able to diagnose these conditions for these children and those families, we're affecting lifetimes, not just for that child, but of course the family and all the people connected to that child. So then going into the types of studies that have been happening, and I thought of this as a little history tour, but actually this is not history. I mean, this DDD study started in 2011, which is, in the lifetime of our current patients. So the big genetic studies, we had to say Cambridge has been a big leader in this field. The deciphering developmental delay studies, the DDD study, was born out of us thinking that actually applying faster genomic testing methods will help achieve diagnoses for patients and their families where those patients clearly have a rare condition, but we just aren't achieving a diagnosis despite the routine things we were doing back in 2011. So it was funded by a Health Innovation Challenge Fund, which I think had some funding from Wellcome as well. And also there's the Sanger Institute, which is based in Cambridge. And it's also supported by the NIHR. So they've recruited over 13,000 patients and then the parents as well. So there's over, I think, 30,000 samples in this. And they've used different methods of looking at the genomic data, but not using whole genome sequencing necessarily. And I'll get on to whole genome in a second, but they've basically been looking at the protein coding regions of the DNA mainly. And the final report has just been published. Exciting news. So it's published in 2023 by Wright and colleagues, and they've made a final diagnosis in about 41% of patients who are recruited to this study. And, numbers don't really make much sense unless you think about how much impact there is from getting a diagnosis for a family who've been struggling on with a very difficult, complicated condition. from that DDD success, there's been the 100,000 genomes pilot, and this started recruiting from 2013, because then at the time we had a certain prime minister who was also sort of a big support of genomic medicine being scaled up. So we had the Department of Health and Social Care, I think, which funded Genomics England, which is a company that is essentially driving the 100,000 Genomes project. And the whole point of this study was to look at, can we diagnose more patients with a rare disease or with cancer by looking at the whole genomes? And this is now not just focusing on just the protein coding regions, but also looking at the non-protein coding regions, as in the black box areas of the DNA that we didn't really know much about before, but now we've developed technologies to start understanding why they are relevant. And we found, so these are patients who had enrolled into this pilot project who had already undergone various types of genetic testing. So it's not like they've just been enrolled from day one because they thought to have a rare disease with no previous genetic testing. They'd already undergone a certain battery of testing. And we still achieved a diagnosis of about a quarter of those patients. And you'd argue that each of those diagnoses has a clinical impact. And a lot of the focus of the pilot was trying to develop an algorithm that worked on the whole for a big scale project. This is an example of one of those patients who received a diagnosis. So if you read this, it really gives you a bit of an impact about how this type of genomic research can help. This 10-year-old girl who previously been over 7 years under investigation, over 300 hospital visits. She ended up getting a curative bone marrow transplant because of the diagnosis she received. And also it meant that there were siblings who were tested predictively because of the genetic variant that she had. And, you know, the peace of mind for the family members knowing that they were not at risk of the same condition. And those are some of the kind of cost figures that are implicated when you think about this. And of course, we've not put into there the cost of achieving the genomic diagnosis. I should say, I guess, the cost of trying to do a sequence of all those 3 billion bases of DNA used to be astronomical, but it's now come to the region of £1,000 or so for, I think, a trio, which means parents and child sampling. At the same time as the Genomics England, the 100,000 Genomes Project, a resource called the NIHR Bioresource was built. And the premise for NIHR Bioresource is to look at 3 types of cohorts, so rare diseases, common disease, and the healthy population. But they also supported specialist work during the pandemic for the COVID-19 participants. They started this initially, again, from Cambridge and then extended out to other centres, and now they have 18 local centres, which then look at enrolling participants into the various arms of the resource. And the difference, I suppose, between NIHR Bioresource and Genomics England, the 100,000 Genomes Project, is that they have, one is that they have 2 very different platforms that the researchers are accessing for the data. And 2, they are, the NIHR Bioresource is trying to create a resource of participants that researchers can call on depending on their research question, whereas the 100,000 Genomes Project was primarily to try and diagnose and help the diagnostic odyssey of patients. So this sort of graphic shows the kind of main centers involved. But we now have more local centers, and Ipswich is a recruiting center for the NIHR bioresource as well. And we are currently trying to set up a center here in Colchester. And so kind of it's very straightforward in terms of they've tried to make it as straightforward as possible in terms of helping consent and enroll people into this bioresource. So they're trying to make it so that it's one-stop shop. Kind of you do the consent for the sample, the questionnaire, and the linking of their healthcare records, obviously all anonymized. And then the ability to be called back for research projects if, for example, they have a certain clinical presentation that's interesting that you can group a lot of different participants with who have the same clinical presentation, or if they have a genetic variant that is the same as a group of people that you can lump together and then call for one project. So it's meant to be a fairly fluid sort of research resource. And that's what that is. So phenotype, your clinical presentation, or genotype, your genetic variants. And there's kind of a central hub that you put your research requests into, or your project idea into, and then sort of a committee will sit and deliberate on that, and then let you know whether you're successful to be able to access a certain data set within that bioresource or not. And these are the types of now the arms of the NIHR bioresource. So there's the healthy participants, there's the rare disease, then there's other arms. So there's inflammatory bowel disease, mental health, which I think is a very interesting part of this. And then there's kind of other arms, including non-alcoholic fatty liver disease and COVID-19, and also developed now a young people's bioresource, which has just started recruiting. And that's meant to try and span not to 18 years old, not to 25 years old, sorry, to then look at the impacts of certain extra, so not just your clinical presentation or anything like that, but your socioeconomic status, your schooling, all those kind of bits about how people then adapt and change and respond to illness. So I think very interesting work that's happening. Just a little bit more about the bioresource. So they've done lots with, they've had lots of success stories basically, and I think the COVID health response was a big part of that. They've just recently started doing more genome type studies with this thing called RNA sequencing. So looking at bits of your genome that will help towards creating DNA. And I think a big factor of the NIHR bioresource is that they're communicating across over 100 NHS trusts, which will be interesting from a health sort of a population level study. So if we are thinking about rare diseases and in children, this is sort of the types of things that I've just gone through already. As you can see, there's lots of trusts participating in this, and there are, and you apply to the rare disease bioresource to enroll the project that you're interested in. So it's blood samples, healthcare records, and then the ability to be recalled to other studies. And then you have the option of receiving back pertinent genetic findings, and that's something that you consent to. And there's a lot of one of the things that the bioresource creators are quite sort of proud of is that they've always had patient voice in the creation of the bioresource. So There's an advisory panel and the participant portal. There's lots of young people's voices in this as well. One of the really great studies, I'd say, that has had, you know, policy level impact is the Next Generation Children study, which was primarily so the PI for this is Professor Lucy Raymond, who's pictured here, and then there's Prof. David Rowich as well, both Cambridge. And they revealed from doing a whole genome sequencing in intensively unwell children, as in children who are in PICUs and NICUs, they were able to find a cause of disease in 30% of these children. And that all of the time had an impact on their care, whether it was to think about palliating the child, whether it was to think about adding in a treatment, whether it was, you know, giving prognostic counseling. It all made an impact. And they were able to get turnaround times for their genetic diagnosis of about 2 weeks. And as a result of the study, they were able to go to government essentially and say, can we roll out whole genome sequencing, as in looking at those 3 billion bases, letters of DNA in our really unwell children, so those children in our NICUs and PICUs. And as a result, that there's that ability to do that now on the NHS. And that's part of the it's factored into the Genome UK plan, which is a government policy that you can look up. And it just goes to show the type of funding that's being put into making sure that the progress we have made remains and remains viable, I suppose. I don't think that's that relevant. So yeah, so the pediatric neurodevelopmental disorders, which is the bioresource study that we're hoping to recruit to in Colchester. So Dr. Marlow will be the PI for this. The investigator is Prof. Patrick Chinnery. The criteria are patients with neurodevelopmental disorders occurring in the pediatric age group who don't have a likely other cause for it, such as a perinatal, you know, a hypoxic brain injury or a tumor, etc. So it will be a, you know, a big part of our population that we're already looking after. They're currently enrolling to try and look at seeing whether whether we can establish diagnoses or enroll patients in other studies as well. These are the contacts for NIHR Bioresource if anybody is interested to find out more, and that's the website that I've given there. And then I don't know how much time we have left, just very quickly. Just wanted to touch on the other Colchester-based studies that we're starting soon. So the NeuralNet, which is a cerebral palsy study, because other studies are suggesting that maybe 1 in 3 people with cerebral palsy might have a genetic cause. However, there aren't any sort of bigger scale projects to confirm this. We are undertaking a pilot study locally, which is also in conjunction with Cambridge as another recruiting centre, and Newcastle, where we are all recruiting 22 children each, so 66 in total, and the families, to look at the whole genome sequence for these children alongside their clinical presentation data to see whether we will find genetic diagnoses. So it's a very new project, which will be getting off the ground hopefully next month, I think. And of course, other projects happening locally in Colchester's Dr. Marlow running the Synapse Centre. We have which means that there'll be a database of patients with neurodevelopmental conditions and trying to cohort them by medical comorbidity a little bit more. And then the aim is that we can then offer a little bit better prognostic counselling if we can understand the way the phenotype profiles work, the way the clinical parts of those patients' presentations work over time. and also potentially link up into clinical trials, depending on because whenever you have a really good, rich data set, pharmaceutical companies are very interested in collaborating when there's good information that we have as a baseline. And then my own personal research ambitions. So I'm interested in looking at a rare disease called mitochondrial diseases, and that's a really really difficult condition to try and diagnose depending on how it presents in people. It can present at any age. That's meant to say devastating. It can look like a common condition. So a mitochondrial disease can present as just diabetes in a slightly older age group, but you'd have additional bits of family history that point you towards this being something more than your lifestyle induced diabetes, let's just say. Or it can be completely, terrible. So pediatric onset and with neurological deterioration. And these conditions, this group of conditions has been getting a lot more press, I suppose, because there's a lot more clinical trials. This graph just shows the number of clinical trials over years that are happening. And that's because there's a real kind of hope right now that we're understanding the genetic basis and we're starting to understand more about the clinical presentations of these patients, that those pharmaceutical companies are pairing us up with the clinical researchers to try and find some potential treatment solutions. There's still no cure as such, but we are making some strides in some of the conditions. And I've been working at creating a database, which is trying to, create a rich resource for comparing these variants, these genetic variants that cause mitochondrial diseases. And that included me going through painstakingly, almost 700 publications and documenting each of the words in those publications in a certain way, so that it becomes much more easy to compare with these large rare disease cohorts that we're looking at. And it's all patient by patient, so that you basically try to look at how similar is a patient who's published to the patient in this cohort who doesn't have a diagnosis. So that's the premise of my work. And I've basically been involved with Genomics England work, as well as with a Europe-wide study called Solve-RD, Solve Rare Diseases. And we've just been showing that actually having really rich databases like my one can show big differences in the types of similarity between certain patients in front of you in that cohort who doesn't have a diagnosis or does have a diagnosis, and patients with a different genetic variant when you look at the literature in a really robust way. So I think it's a really, really exciting time for pediatrics in terms of the buzzwords around at the moment. So we have genomic research that's really taking off, which has been in the making from 2011 from the DDD project, 2013 with Genomics England and the 100,000 pilot, and NIHR Bioresource around the same time. And the big infrastructure is being put into place. So it's going to start filtering down to DGHs, and genetic test results are going to be filtering down further into the health visitor roles, to the midwife roles. So it's really important that we understand the basis of where patients are going to have genetic testing done, whether they're involved in research studies, and what the impact of all of that will be on them and their families. And it's not just rare diseases that will benefit from genomics. And this little snapshot is one of the cancer publications, so the whole genome sequencing for children, and using that guideline basically to put your child with a certain type of cancer into a certain type of clinical treatment group, and that's all based on their genetics. And then, of course, the newborn genome screening program is on the horizon. If people we don't have the time to talk about that yet now, but that's, I think, a very interesting ethical minefield that is coming up for us. I think I'll end there. I've got lots of resources. If anybody does want to learn more about it, I'd recommend going to the Genomics England website, the podcast, and the East Genomics website as well. And then for mitochondrial disease, Lilly Foundation. Thank you.
Many thanks, Thiloka. Thank you. I appreciate delivering a talk from a hospital room is really hard. And it was a really good overview of where we are with genetics and our local input and what we're trying to achieve here. I think from just to take a few messages from your talk, many children in our area who currently have a diagnosis of a severe learning impairment or other diagnostic label like autism have a genetic condition which is undiagnosed. And in the future, if we do diagnose these children correctly with their underlying genetic change, it opens up more potential for treatment, which will impact on that child's general health, but also their ability to learn and live a happy, meaningful life. And it's balancing testing with the implications of what that means for the child and the family, which is a really grey area. The more in medicine you look for, the more you will find, but it's how you interpret it and how ready are that child and the family for that interpretation. But no doubt in the future, as Thiloka has alluded to, I would say in the next 10 years, most people will have their whole genome sequenced, and it will be done early. And that is the reality of health. And with that becomes a lot of ethical implications of knowing your own genetic code and knowing which areas of health you're most susceptible to get, what conditions you're going to get, is very hard to get your head around. But in terms of now and how we use genetic testing, it will be to try and understand children who have these diagnostic labels which are really woolly and hard to define what they mean. So I'm really hoping with our projects we're doing here, we can improve upon our diagnosis, better diagnosis of children, and to be able to help them better medically and educationally. Does anyone have any questions?
I realize I probably whizzed through a lot of that.
I think with these talks, we're trying to balance health with other areas of health and education, and it's trying to make it accessible for everyone. And I think the reality is genetic testing is something which we need to know about, and it's certainly is a technology available now, and more people do need to be aware of it and the implications of what this would mean. So thanks, Thiloka, for coming to talk. It was really appreciate.
Yeah,
really appreciate it. Okay, so I'm going to move on. I know we're running a bit ahead of time, but the next talk's going to be from Kierran Pearce, and he sadly can't be with us today, but he has recorded something for us, which I'm going to share. So I'll just download that now. So I'm going to share my screen. Apologies, there's been a technical glitch. I'm just going to try and play it again and restart it. Bear with me, sorry.
Ben, we're not able to hear the sound.
Thanks for that. I don't know why. I'll try again. Sorry. Sorry, bear with me. I think I haven't had to do it before with recording, so I'll try again.
Hello, my name is Kierran Pearce and I lead
How's
the
that, Hannah? Is that
Multi-Schools
okay?
Council, which is all about listening
Yeah,
to
I
the
can hear
voices
it.
of
Yeah, the sound.
young people. It's something I set up back in 2012, and the reason for setting it up was while I was working at a special needs school within Essex, a young girl approached one day and said that the support she and her friends got was brilliant, but that one day she and her friends had to leave that setting, and simply other young people, other adults, other professionals didn't understand what it meant to have learning differences. And so we set about setting up ways to go into schools and educate others about our differences. And that work has really evolved since then. We now work across the Essex local authority with young people in all different parts of Essex, and working with professionals to help improve that awareness. The reason for talking here today is to have a focus around anxiety and stress, and especially the impact of that on young people with neurodiversity. So we take in lots of feedback from young people throughout our sessions, whether that be in schools or through our ambassador program, where young people may join us outside of the school gates, but also through working with other professionals across education, health and social care. So today's session is meant to touch on a few of those issues, to give you some time to think about things that young people want you to think about, and hopefully raise some questions that you can raise with other colleagues as well, and get you to really think about some of the things that young people, as I say, are really keen for us to talk about. So the session is going to focus on the areas that you can see on the screen now. Obviously, I'd much rather be doing this session with you in person. Apologies that I can't be with you. But hopefully, as I say, it will still allow you time to pause and just to have a little think about some of the things that young people do want you to focus on. So there's a few areas that we're going to touch on and bring in some of the work that we have done recently and over a period of time. So we've got our school attendance report, which I'm going to touch on, and obviously has some strong links into mental health and especially stress and anxiety. We've done a recent piece of work around health improvement, so looking from young people's perspectives and some key focus questions around how health services could improve in general. And that feedback went to the NHSE National Improvement Send Board, which is looking to drive those changes forward. So I will elaborate a little bit more on that as we go through. We've also got some feedback from our autism, ADHD and mental health work in schools. And we are going to focus on masking. It's an area that our ambassadors really want us to focus on at the moment and are really keen for us to link into this presentation today. So we will have a discussion around that and some feedback and some thoughts from young people. So we're going to start with the attendance report. So to give you a bit of background on this, during the summer of 2022, we worked with schools, again, across Essex, young people from primary, mainstream, secondary schools, and from special schools, pupil referral units, all types of settings. We were able to speak to around 300 young people who gave their views on school attendance. And obviously what that helped us to do was to look firstly at what might help keep some young people in school, but also what were some of the things that were detracting from young people wanting to be in school. And a lot of that did link into mental health and mental well-being, and breaking down some of the real key reasons of why young people may not want to attend school. Now, obviously, there's many different elements to this, and we're only just picking out the things relevant for today. But I think it's really important to bear in mind that obviously it's very individual. Although we're trying to collate this information, give an overview, attendance at school is something that is very individual, and there's lots of factors. One of the big things that was spoken about from young people was anxiety. And I think one of the things we really wanted to drill down to was anxiety can have lots of different meanings for different people. And what we want to try and really understand when we work with young people is, can we identify the source? So where has that anxiety come from, and what does that actually mean for an individual? As I say, the amount of young people we spoke to, anxiety meant a range of different things. And I think our advice to professionals from the feedback we've had is, can we really identify it? And is it a feeling of anxiety, or is it a feeling of worry, or is it a feeling of happiness, but they're just not quite sure how to explain that and what that actual feeling means to them? Now, we know from a lot of our work that feelings in general and understanding feelings can be sometimes quite challenging. So it is about using our resources around us to break that down. But sometimes that word anxiety can start to stick with children, and in essence, that creates more anxiety as such, because they're not really sure what that feeling means for them. So a lot of our work at the moment is really starting to get schools to really try and consider, what do young people feel anxiety means? And if there is a particular individual as well, what does that anxiety mean for that individual? We spoke lots in the report about having a more therapeutic approach within schools. And when we spoke about therapy here, we weren't talking initially about kind of one-to-one support that young people were after. This was about the whole ethos and the whole environment of that school, and actually thinking about, on a day-to-day basis, how do we interact with young people? How do we ensure they feel safe? And we'll come to more of that throughout this presentation. I think something that was really clear was that we talked lots, especially in our autism sessions, around context and how young people may be looking at the world through a different context. And actually, when it comes to school attendance, there may be some things that are just expected of a young person to understand or to grasp or fall into, almost those routines that we might just think are the norm. But for some of the young people we spoke to, actually that norm in their minds was very different, and they couldn't understand the context of why something was being done or delivered in that way. And that then caused stress in terms of not really understanding the full picture. We do a lot of work with adults as well in our line of work, and we talk lots about, again, safety and what helps you to feel safe. And a lot of responses we get back are around having a bit of a plan and understanding what is going on. So then we flip that, and if young people don't understand what is happening throughout their day, especially when it applies to school, or they don't have a bit of a plan in their minds, and that can cause a lot of barriers. So it's thinking here about, again, is there a clear plan? Do they understand the context of a different situation? The biggest barrier to young people with additional needs was bullying. So in terms of our work, we're trying to respond to that at the moment with schools. We've developed some anti-bullying assemblies that we're rolling out officially from September. And it's really, again, making sure that we will have a focus on that, not just in education, but across all sectors. I think especially in education, looking at schools and how we deal with those types of things. So again, that understanding of difference is so important. You know, when we don't ever talk about differences or neurodiversity, that's then when those barriers start to appear through ignorance, you know, not having that understanding and that information. So making sure that we're doing some work there, because we know that bullying will have a massive impact on stress and anxiety. I think one of the things that came out from young people as well was the breakdown in connection with parents, maybe between schools and the home, as kind of a fallout from the impact of COVID, in that obviously a lot of more things were done separately, and actually, again, how we then get parents back involved within the school and local communities as well, because they felt that the more connection there was there, the reduced anxiety and stress there was, not just on that young person, but on their family as a whole. So I think that was something important to reflect on as well, that stress and anxiety might not actually be coming from that young person themselves, but could be passed down from whoever they are within the home. So really important to kind of bear that in mind as well. Preparation and information does really link into the context again. So, you know, how do we understand how young people will understand the information that's being given to them. So do we need to break it down slightly? Are we looking more at visual information here, or do we need to explain it in a different way? So again, if we can paint a clear picture, first of all, we may be able to reduce that anxiety and stress. We know that change can cause anxiety and stress, not just for young people, but for adults as well. And again, thinking about how we prepare young people for change, those transition points that we may talk about. Again, do we do enough work around that to reduce some of that stress and anxiety? One of the things I always talk about in schools, and I'll probably hold my hands up and say I may have done this in the past, a young person may come up to us and say they're worried about something that may be happening in, let's say, 10 months' time. And a response from us might be, oh, well, we don't need to worry about that yet. But actually, if that young person's coming to us now, that is a worry for them right now, even if it is in the future. So it's about not dismissing and how we address. And we may not be able to have a solution to every worry or everything that might form a kind of stress or anxiety response, but at least we are starting to address it. And then that's the way we're getting to the root, first of all, and understand where that's coming from. Sensory needs, I think, is a big thing in terms of a school environment. You know, it can be very overwhelming. They can be obviously very busy places, and again, it's about helping schools to understand what are the sensory needs of those young people, those individuals, and making sure, again, those resources are in place, and we can break down what we need to make sure that that young person gets what they need, and ultimately, if those needs aren't being met, again, that can result in many different responses from that young person. We've done a lot of work recently in terms of understanding young people's needs from a range of areas. And I think toileting is something that keeps coming up in terms of young people, where maybe, again, those needs aren't being met, the impact that can have on toileting and issues associated with that. And again, helping schools to understand that as well. So we know our body will respond in different ways when we're stressed. And it's about making sure, again, schools have that information and young people have the resources to be able to express that. So I think there's a lot of understanding that needs to go into that. And I think hopefully, you know, in the next couple of years, we can really start to try and push that from different angles in terms of understanding different toileting needs of young people. So having a look here at the impact of obviously some of the things we've just mentioned, and then also some of the interventions that within the report we're suggesting schools to really have a focus on. So I think obviously the impact of these things not working is the non-attendance, and we know that there can be different ways for young people to learn, and obviously learning from home is an option. We're not dismissing that at all, that can work really well for some young people. We also know that some young people could actually benefit a lot more from being in school, and there's some good reasons for them to be there if some of the interventions could be put in place. But obviously non-attendance is one of the impacts. A distrust in the system. So, you know, if you start to move away from something like that, that can paint a picture of what the system might or might not be able to do for you in the future. And then, you know, there's a bigger disconnect, which ultimately won't be helpful for that young person, and an unmet need, and that might be the needs with their education might be better met, but socially those needs then aren't being met, and although that may be okay in some situations, in others that may have a real negative impact on that young person. A lack of communication skills in terms of how they're able to communicate with different people, if they're not able to attend. Mental health challenges, so research to show that, you know, that can really have a knock-on effect in terms of the lack of social interaction, lack of being able to have an education. The impact that can then have on people's mental health is massive. The peer-to-peer rejection then, so again, not being part of a group, not being able to socialize with others in a way that works for them, and as I mentioned, that kind of food and sleep issues as well. So lots of research again to show that the impact on, you know, anxiety and stress in terms of lack of eating or sleep issues, and we'll come more to that as we go through this session as well. So interventions, we spoke about just some of them here, and I'll give you a link to our website where you can read the full report if it's something you're interested in terms of school attendance. The culture shift in terms of making sure there's an ask from schools around, there's not an expectation that young people have to be in school, but actually they want to be in school. So why should young people want to be in school, and how do we get young people feeling safe, wanting to be there? And that safe space will fit into that as well. So again, one of the things we ask schools is, have you got a safe space? If I went into your school, would a young person be able to tell me where that safe space is? Anti-bullying work as well, I think is really important. As I said, we've got the assemblies, we're also encouraging schools to make sure they're speaking to a diverse group of young people, and involving them in their anti-bullying policy. You know, some schools will do things like anti-bullying ambassadors and different ways of doing it. And I think it's really important we don't lose sight of that was a real big reason why young people may not be attending school, and impacting on their stress and anxiety levels as well. As I've already mentioned, have we really explored the word anxiety? Are we engaging with parents? And what are our communication methods? We know one size does not fit all. And when we're talking about neurodiversity, obviously this comes into play even more so, and making sure that we have different ways of communicating with young people, and we're really focusing on that as well. So just a few things here to mention. I know I've just got to summarise today, but looking at school attendance, the impact that can have, and how we might be able to support some of that as well. So the next area I'm going to touch on is health feedback. So as I said, we did some work with just under 100 young people in a very short space of time, looking at general questions in terms of health services, what they want to see in terms of improvement, what were some of the challenges, and what were some of the positives as well. For this session, I'm just going to focus on some of the things that they felt are having an impact, again linking that into stress and anxiety. And again, just some food for thought for people that are on the call today. So I think one of the things that came out really clearly was not being prepared for appointments. And obviously that could be a range of appointments, from going to see the doctor, from going to the dentist, whatever it may be in terms of linking to their health. But again, how that may link into anxiety and stress responses. So there's a bit of a pattern here already, isn't there, between the things of lack of preparation and not really having a clear plan. And again, reflecting on how we give young people that information and how we do it. So, just by telling some young people, we know that that's not going to be a way that is going to work for them. Again, how do we show that visually, for example? So making sure we're thinking about how we display information really importantly. The waiting times is something that kind of speaks for itself. I think as adults, we're all acutely aware, but knowing that can have an impact, if they're waiting for the right support, they're not getting it. I think lots of people's frustrations, I'm sure, are if they can't get to that support that they need, or they can't get to that appointment, what is there in the medium term to support, or in the short term to support that young person? It shouldn't just be, well, here's the waiting list, thank you very much. So making sure we work with partners to really understand that. And I know certain areas have really looked at that pathway and what that looks like locally. And that's something that young people really want to see happening more of. Unclear language, again, how professionals may use language when they speak to them directly, making sure we have an understanding of where young people are at with their understanding themselves, and how we might be able to break things down, which kind of links into the two clinical response. So where the language is maybe overly clinical, and again, it hasn't been broken down for young people to understand the impact that can have on their stress and anxiety of a certain situation. And that could be very much reduced just by that change of language. So are we on the same page? Or if we are talking to the adults, how we give the adults support to give the right information to the young people, so the young people understand that. Really, really important to consider. I think, again, something that really stood out was young people saying about how health professionals may not really know about them. And when they see them, that doesn't really give them much confidence, because they're almost scratching their heads of, why am I here? Is this professional really going to understand what I need? So having a real clear picture and making sure things like, one-page profiles, for example, are really clear, and our professionals may have access to that, so they know a little bit about that young person, and we can build those connections and relationships, which again can really help to reduce some of those stress and anxiety responses from what young people tell us. I think preparing for future, and we again touched on it slightly in the last section, but again, do young people have access to that information? So many young people we speak to may get a diagnosis, and then it's never explained to them what that diagnosis means. That can be very scary, and again, that can create a lot of anxiety, a lot of stress, and that could be resolved if things were broken down And there was a little bit of guidance on what does this mean for me, and obviously that would be individual, but if we can get that information there, and health professionals feeling confident to give that information, again, that could really help to reduce some of that stress and anxiety. And that's why it is about understanding that diagnosis is so important. As part of our role going into schools, helping young people have a basic overview, but that still needs to be broken down individually on a one-to-one basis. I think the big thing in terms of what we're really talking to services about all of the time, and the sound bites that come from young people, is that early intervention word that always comes up. And I mean, just to summarize it, the quote on the screen, I think it summarizes it really well, that if we're always looking at putting our resources to halfway down that river, we're really not understanding why people are falling in the first place. And I think, again, something like stress and anxiety, it keeps going back to that starting point. Can we find where that may have come from? Now, there are going to be certain situations that do just, our natural responses can cause us to feel more stressed or to feel more anxious. And then it's seeing those things in isolation, but then also looking at the tools of how we might be able to manage those situations. But then with other things that may go on over a longer period of time, is thinking about that river and how we get in early. So we're really keen, and I think when we talk to some health professionals about this who are really honest, that again, even that SEND awareness in that professional kind of area and arena is not always as strong as it could be, and we need to really be thinking about how we change that. One of our big frustrations is that there may be resources support that's put in place, maybe aiming at young people who don't have neurodiversity, and then afterwards it's then thought about how we might adapt that resource or that response, and it's too late then. So actually thinking firstly, how is this going to be applicable to all young people? How can we adapt it and make it accessible for all? And I think that's something that we will continue pushing, and making sure young people have a real strong voice in that, because the only way we can understand that is if we listen to young people themselves. So I'm going to focus now on autism, and as I say, that there's so much that we go into, and I'm really just trying to simplify and break it down as much as I can in the time that I've been given today. So as I say, we do go into schools and we deliver workshops to young people around autism. We also offer staff CPD, and we obviously work with a lot of young people who have autism as part of our ambassador program, so where young people get involved in different projects outside of school. And some things to really link in here in terms of stress and anxiety and mental health overall as well. So I think one of the big things young people talk to us about is the negative portrayal of autism and what it might mean for them, and socially how that may be seen, and the impact again that can have on their mental health. So the negative connotations of every autistic person is going to do this or do that, or look like this or act like this. And it's about making sure again that we really get that language out there in terms of autism is very different for each young person, and if you've met one young person with autism, you've only met one young person with autism. It's that type of language, and making sure that everybody is seen as different, which then transpires into the one size fits all approach doesn't work, and making sure we have those adaptive responses. And I think again, some of this is repeated in terms of the different slides, but it's because it's so clearly coming from our young people in terms of that lack of adaptive communication and understanding. So when we are responding to young people, there's a barrier there. If we don't have those communication skills, we don't feel that we have the resources, etc. That's going to be a massive barrier, which then can result in that stress and anxiety. So just stopping and thinking, as a professional, as a team, how are we adapting our communication to make sure that we're meeting the needs of these different young people, and how we retain that information, but also how young people retain the information that we're giving them. So some of the young people we were really talking to recently were talking about how if something's explained to them once, that doesn't work. They may actually need it explained a few times so they can really store that. And although that's extra work and extra time, if that extra work and extra time is put in the first place, then there's not that negative experience later down the line because they haven't really understood the message. And that negative experience down the line may very well much be more stress, more anxiety, because they haven't understood that information that's been given to them first, and they haven't been able to retain that and then apply it to whatever situation that may be. So again, really important to understand how young people are retaining that information, and we may need to repeat that. It's not just we're going to give this to a young person first of all. And these were some of the things that really came out from the young people we work with who have a diagnosis of autism. I would have loved to have been with you in person, as I've already said, because just talking at you straight, it does seem a little bit much, and I don't want you to get bored of my voice. So I'm just going to do a little activity here as well, which hopefully you can just try within this session. And it's an activity that we do within our autism awareness sessions for school staff, and it's just getting us to, again, to reflect on some of the things that can really impact on those stress and anxiety kind of responses. And kind of looking at where that may come from as well. So I want you to imagine that you walk into a room full of people you don't know. So for some of you already on this call, you might be thinking, absolutely no way, no thank you, Kierran. The lights are bright, the food on the menu is seafood, and the room is very loud and full of conversation. So there's lots of things happening. One room is hot and one is cold, so you can't decide if you want to keep your jacket on or take it off. And you can't read anyone's emotions. So you know if people are happy, sad, angry, you just don't know. And some of the language you use, you just simply don't understand. So you can almost imagine you're in a foreign country and you don't speak that language. And that would be my question to you all. And no alcohol is allowed. I think we've put that on there because that may be how some adults get through difficult social situations. Obviously, young people don't have that choice. So we're going to break this down and have a little look at what this might mean for young people. And again, then how that might link into stress and anxiety. So the walking into a room full of people you don't know. Again, we talk in schools, and sorry if this is too schools focused, but I think we can take the learning and apply it to lots of different situations. If you think about in a classroom where a young person may be for long periods of that day, especially in a primary setting, they get used to that environment, they get used to the people around them. Maybe they do start to feel more comfortable. But then if we take that and look at a school assembly, for example, they've then got to go into a different room where they don't go much. There's lots more people. There's people they haven't interacted with before. They don't really understand them. That's a very, very different experience. So it's looking at the environment here and really thinking about, okay, what has changed? And actually, how do we approach that? Is it something we need to break down in small steps? Do we need to do it preparation? It's that preparation word again, to reduce some of that anxiety around what this new experience might feel like. So just going and visiting the hall space regularly, or taking some pictures and sharing those regularly. Again, thinking about how we give that information is really important. Again, the lights and the food, etc. I've given my own personal story on this one. So I remember working with a young boy before in a school who was pre-verbal, and every lunchtime he wasn't eating his lunch. So he had a packed lunch, and where he was eating was right next to where the school dinners were being served. The school then moved this young person to a different place in the hall, and the young person started to eat his packed lunch. Now, what we could kind of evaluate from that situation and summarize was that the smells and the noise that was coming from where the dinner was being served was just too overwhelming for that young person. And they couldn't really communicate that in a way that then the adults could understand. So the young person moved somewhere else. And as I say, that those noises, those smells have reduced, and that young person could then eat their lunch. And again, so it's about evaluating the different sensory inputs that may be having an impact on that young person. Have we really understood that? And have we observed that enough? Have we spent time to really see that? Because that, again, may link into how a child or young person feels about that experience. And it's the same with temperature. Again, you know, how temperature can change the way different people respond, and have we understood that and evaluated that? So that evaluation is really, really key because of, again, of that stress and anxiety that it may cause. As I mentioned earlier, the reading of emotions and understanding feelings is something that we know can be a real challenge in different ways. and again in different environments. So again, thinking about the resources we might link to that to make sure that we're explaining emotions and feelings in a way that works for that young person. Because if a young person is really struggling to understand their own emotions, they're not going to understand
Then we've lost sound again.
Sound's gone down, sorry.
Sorry about that. I will try again. Try this.
breaks it down at different levels, and also helps you to think about the different questions you may pose depending on where they are on their communication journey. So really important to kind of focus on that, and look at, are we going too high in terms of our language delivery, or actually could we be extending some of these young people? Because again, that is that understanding, isn't it? If we don't have that understanding, if we don't know what's being communicated to us, that can cause a lot of difficulties. So moving on to ADHD as well, and I'm trying not to make it too specific to different areas of need, and trying to just bring it all back into our focus today with mental health. So these are some of the things that we touch on that we feel have a link within our ADHD sessions. So we know a lot of young people who have a diagnosis of ADHD may also have other areas of learning need as well. We see that with over half of the young people, from the research and pictures that we see and understand. So it is about understanding that whole picture, not just focusing on one area of need, but what else is it that that young person may need to access their learning. Again, removing those barriers that may reduce that stress and anxiety response. So for example, we talk about a child with ADHD who every English lesson may find it challenging to do some writing, and that adult may put it down to the fact that maybe they've lost concentration within the delivery of what's expected for that young person in the starter activity, and so that's why they're not engaging. But actually it could be that they're dyslexic and that's never been understood or never been recognized, and then we just label it as maybe one area of need. So making sure we see the whole picture and we really think about what might be impacting that young person. Really lots of research and even from our own kind of work of poor levels of self-esteem with young people with ADHD. So there's really low opinions of themselves. And I will, again, before we finish, touch on the impact of that. So again, any work around boosting levels of self-esteem, giving them that better feeling amongst themselves and how that may look then amongst their peers, really important to kind of understand and consider. We all have that fight, flight or freeze response. And often we'll find with young people who have ADHD, those responses can be activated slightly quicker. So again, thinking about those touch points, what is it that activates those responses? Can we really understand that? And do we have the support around that to recognize it? One of the things we always talk about is never dealing with a behavior at its highest point. So if a young person has gone into one of those responses and they're in that heightened state, we're not going to find a solution in that moment. So keeping them safe and getting to a point where maybe then we can have those conversations afterwards, but not trying to find the solution at that time. We know that food and sleep are two big things in terms of the impact on a young person and how that may look then generally with their mental health, especially if they have a diagnosis of ADHD. So a couple of things, obviously sleep kind of does speak for itself in terms of a lack of sleep, and how that may portray again then into their responses in different situations, because we know what a lack of sleep can do to our brains. But also the impact of food in terms of if a young person is taking ADHD medication, for example. Lots of young people talk to us about the struggles initially with that medication, maybe getting the right dose, the impact that can have on their feeling of hunger, and then not necessarily eating at the same time as their peers. And it's about making those accommodations as well. So one thing, again, we pose to professionals is, you know, if you as an adult and you were taking medication for whatever reason, and then you weren't feeling hungry but were made to eat at a specific time because that's the time that was expected within that setting, you wouldn't want to eat. So it's about, again, thinking how that might feel for a young person again, and making those reasonable adjustments. So I'm going to get you just to reflect on these pictures, and if you want to pause me at this point, because again you're getting a little bored of my voice, then you can. But usually in our sessions, I would give you some thinking time, looking at these two pictures, focusing again on ADHD, because that's just the area we've been looking at recently, around what these pictures might have to do with it, and then I'll link that again back into stress and anxiety. So if you just have a little think about what they may have to do with anxiety, we've got the with ADHD, we've got the moths around the light bulb, and we've got the boy on the bike about to go down a hill. So I'm going to start with the moths around the light bulb. So something we talk a lot about in ADHD is young people having a singular focus, and where they may be able to really focus in on one area of something that's really appealing to them. The challenges may come when they are asked to change that focus or move on to something new, because that singular focus has really overtaken their whole level of enjoyment and what they're getting out of that activity. So really thinking about those, again, those transition points and how we might be able to break things down. We ask schools to go even further and think about, again, their use of visual resources and how they do that within the school, because we know that may work. Again, we talk about how they may be able to level things out and make sure there's a really clear objective to what's expected for that young person, and that it's more instant rather than it being made over a long period of time. Again, all of that kind of stuff may reduce that stress and anxiety of an activity finishing or changing. So there's lots more we go into detail there within our teacher sessions, but again, it's that singular focus, I think, is the key for this. Understanding that and understanding how we might help young people move from one thing to the next. The boy on the bike, about to go down a hill. With this, we talk about the brakes in the brain. So what we mean by that is how young people might be able to slow themselves down and get themselves into a place to learn or a place to access something that they need. And we know that for some people with ADHD, some of those challenges within inattentiveness and impulsiveness can have an impact on that. But again, thinking about things that may be able to support that young person to bring that brain to a slower way of operating and be able to make those right choices at the right time to reduce, again, that stress and anxiety. So, and we'll go on to talking about some of those interventions, but that's what that picture has to do with ADHD as well. And if you want to read more around ADHD specifically, there is a good book called ADHD Living Without Brakes. So some of the interventions linked into this. So we talk lots with ADHD around using a reward system and how this may link into supporting a young person, but some really key questions to consider here. So is it based on the individual rather than just pulling off, you know, a generic style system? Does the young person understand it? How is it communicated between home and school? So home and school can be very different places for lots of young people, but how that may look in different environments, and sometimes, again, go back to the language we use with young people, really important, and how we can build on their strengths. So within a reward system, linking back to self-esteem, how can we build in some of the things that we know they're really good at, and so they can see their achievements through a reward system. So reward systems obviously can be made up of anything, but some of the principles there hopefully are clear. Having really clear boundaries around a system, so, you know, not stretching them every day, because that consistency is really important. Picking our battles, we talk lots about that in terms of, again, young people knowing where they are. The reward system is all about positive reinforcement, so making sure that doesn't link into any consequences to anything else. It is all about that positive reinforcement. Giving time, I think, is so important, giving time for that system to work, and giving time for young people to understand it. Having responsibility, So sometimes we say about giving jobs to young people with ADHD, keeping them busy. And again, that may be particularly useful in those transition points where there isn't that kind of really clear singular focus. And you can keep that mind busy and reduce, again, in any of that anxiety of, I'm not quite sure where I'm looking right now, I'm not quite sure where I'm at, and actually having something to focus on. Again, advice on medication I think is really key, not just taking your own advice from your own health professionals. I'm really strong with schools and saying that as schools, that's not something as professionals we should be saying in terms of they should or shouldn't be medicated. It's about making sure that the health professionals have those conversations with you. Something to focus on. So again, links into that responsibility. What is it that they may be? Maybe a doodle pad, fidget toy. Again, something that may help that young person. I remember in those difficult times where things may get very challenging for that young person, where they do feel very overwhelmed, where they do have heightened anxiety and heightened stress levels, but it's not personal. Those responses are not personal to us. That's a portrayal of how they're feeling at that moment. Clear speech, I've said enough about that, and you can link back to how we use clear speech and visuals again, some reoccurring messages there, and how we reduce that stress and anxiety of young people. So in lots of our work, especially our mental health focused work, we do link it back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We found it a really useful tool to work with young people with as well. And obviously, like any tool, there are pros and cons in terms of the research and bits that have gone into it. But for this, it really kind of does bring together some of the things that we've mentioned, and understanding that stress and anxiety and where it has come from. So obviously the idea of Maslow is that everybody on this call, every young person will have their own needs, so their own pyramid or own triangle. And obviously everybody wants to be at the top of their triangle. That's when they're feeling their best and doing their best and being their best. But we know, it's not realistic to feel that every day we're going to be at the top of that triangle, because the needs below this are not always met, or are met in different ways or different amounts. And I think, again, it is about considering that when we work with young people, and again, that anxiety and stress. So those basic needs, and we've already spoke about with neurodiversity, especially, that food, and just for one example, or sleep, could be affected in different ways. So again, having that understanding, having other professionals know about that as well, and that understanding of that may be where those responses are coming from, and what is some of the support we might be able to put in place. Safety, we did touch on that. What helps you to feel safe? Those questions are really important. Where are those safe spaces? The belongingness and love, so that peer-to-peer connection, which again we have touched on slightly, understanding that. And as you can see, self-esteem is that really important layer before we feel that fulfillment, and we can get to that top layer, and we can be our best and achieve our best. So understanding those self-esteem needs is so important. What does self-esteem mean, and what does it mean to that young person? And in some of our sessions, we've got young people to do their own triangles and think about their own needs, and think about, again, that it's a bit of a ladder. If we were to draw a ladder next to this, we are going up and down all the time, but if we could start to understand our needs a bit more, and professionals help and understand our needs, then that all links into feeling like we're climbing up that pyramid. So just some other things to touch on in terms of general mental health, and how that links into Maslow. So that feeling of safety, a question I'd get you to reflect on today if I was doing this in person is, what helps you to feel safe? It's so many different things that can impact on our safety needs. And obviously how safe we feel can then also translate into how anxious or how stressed we might feel about a certain situation. So safety, have we really understood safety? Positive praise, I think, again, linking back to the self-esteem, positive praise needs to be delivered in different ways. So understanding, what does that mean for that young person? I think remembering what young people say is so powerful. It sounds very basic, doesn't it? But in a world where we can all be very busy and we've got so much going on in our own minds, it's very easy to maybe overlook. But just those clear messages. If a young person has maybe come to us on a Monday and said, my sister at the weekend got a bike and she's riding it, and then a week later we ask that same young person, how's your sister getting on with that bike? How's she getting on with riding that bike? And just that connection, because we've listened to that young person, how valuable that can feel for that young person. Managing social media, I think, is a big one. We can't really talk about anxiety and stress and the impact on mental health without mentioning social media. So again, understanding how that might be impacting a young person, some of the mechanisms again in place to support that are really important for us to understand. Having very clear boundaries as well for that young person, I think is really clear, needs to be really clear, sorry, and we really need to understand that. Understanding change, we have mentioned, what does that change mean for that young person? But also we're focusing a lot, my role is obviously working with young people, but we also appreciate that if we are going to support young people, whether that be as a professional or a parent, we also need to look after ourselves and our own anxiety and stress levels as well. So we spoke very early on in this session about how that can sometimes be translated down. And so making sure we do a bit of self-reflection and focus on ourselves as well. So some of the strategies and interventions we've spoke about, how could that apply to you as an adult as well? And as I've said, where have the roots come from? Where have the roots of the anxiety and stress? Can we kind of go back to that? Can we go back to the seeds of where that's grown from and really understand it and what it means for each individual? So the last area I'm going to touch on briefly is masking, because it's something that our young people are really keen for us to bring in when any work that we do currently around mental health, that may link to stress and anxiety as well. So I think what we want to talk with all professionals and schools really about masking is making sure that when we do get feedback from different environments, that we believe it and we understand it and we look to see how we might be able to reduce that. So again, really common example is, at schools where a young person, schools may say, we don't see any of that when they're at school. They get home and the parents may phone up and say, this is happening each day. And there's maybe that lack of belief between the two. And it's about making sure that we do believe that, that Coke bottle effect being, chuck all day and then that lid coming off when they're in their safe space. So again, just little interventions, things like having a young person have a break before they go home, having a diary, having a talk, some intervention on the ability level that will work for them, because we do need to understand things in different environments. Stimming is really important to understand. There's not one form of stimming. I think that's something that comes up a lot in terms of, we haven't seen a young person stim in this way, so they can't be stimming, when actually we know stimming can be very subtle. And when a child is anxious or they are stressed, there may be subtle signs of that stimming. So it's important that we understand that, because that might help us to identify when they're finding something difficult and help us to apply when we put the intervention in place. Again, how they're processing the different sensory information that's coming their way. Is there a change in their communication when they're going into a different environment? Again, have we understood that? Understanding their peer relationships, observing that and how they mix with friends, because again, that masking can be very tiring, and actually we might be able to pick up some of that through how they work with their friends. And again, considering our language, I think is really, really important. We've spoken like that the whole way through, but if a young person doesn't understand us, but is unable to tell us because they're masking that, they don't want to come across as maybe in their own way of perceiving it, and they're being silly or stupid, but actually have they understood language, I think is really, really important. So the questions for people to consider is thinking about, what level of support do we have in place when we talk about masking? Have we communicated effectively with that young person so they understand what is happening? And also the long-term effects. We know that, if young people are constantly masking, how tiring that can be for them and the impact that generally can have on their mental health. So really important to understand this area. So just some very quick support resources to touch on. I'm not going to go through them today just because of time, and I know you've got some other things happening today as well. There are loads of resources out there, and it can obviously seem a bit of a minefield. So we've just picked out the Autism Education Trust, the website. Social Stories are good to understand. The ADHD Foundation is another website. You've got Young Minds, which focuses on mental health. Autism.org website, and Mindshift, Positive Penguins, and SAM are all different apps that you can look at, again focusing on mental health and how potentially they may be able to reduce stress and anxiety amongst young people. Thank you for listening to me today. I hope you've managed to stay involved in it, even though I'm not here. If you've got any questions or want to find out more about any of our work following this, there's my email address. You can find more about us on our website, and you can follow us on social media as well by liking and following our page, which really helps us to raise awareness of what we're doing and help more young people to be heard. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kierran. Kierran apologises he couldn't be here in person, but it was a great talk. I took some messages from there and overlap, certainly with anxiety. Definitely with the parental anxiety at home, children with autism we find very sensitive to stress in other people. So if home isn't going well and stress levels are high, that can really impact behaviour. And as he mentioned with the pyramid system, if you look at safety and security, it's right at the bottom. And if children don't feel safe or secure, they can't learn and they can't be happy or self-empowered. So unless that's addressed early, that also will matter. And the idea of being wanted, and I would also flip that around and say for the schools to want the child to be there. And many children we see don't feel wanted, and they feel that the school don't want them to be in school because of their differences. And the last thing I'd say is about, really importantly, we need to find a better way of linking up with education and health to better understand and define these behaviours, and because at the end of the day they're a communication for us to try and understand, and some of those reasons are medical, some of them are more along the lines of the school experience, but they're all interconnected. Right, so does anyone have any questions before we start? Okay, well, I appreciate it's been a long, the talk's been quite long, and thank you for your time. This will be recorded and put on our website, which you can visit at a later date. And thank you once again for your support of the education series. The next one, and the last in the series, will be Sense 4, which will focus on transition, and that will be in July. I'll put that on our website. But thanks for joining once again, and see you all soon.
Thank you.